Pablo Escobar, obviously, when he was killed, the whole idea of this is over, when in fact, those who helped kill him, which included criminal groups and paramilitaries, those guys who killed him became the single largest criminal organization on planet Earth in the years that followed. It's like hardly the solution to take out these kingpins.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. Today, we are going to be talking about what you need to know about the criminal groups that the U.S. has recently labeled as foreign terrorist organizations. My guest for today is Steven Dudley. Steven is an American journalist. He's an author and a policy analyst specializing in organized crime and security issues in Latin America. He is also the co-founder and co-director of Insight Crime, a nonprofit think tank dedicated to investigating organized crime and corruption across the Americas. His reporting and his research have made him one of the leading voices on the intersection of crime, politics, and society in the Americas. Let's dive into the episode. I mean, instead of talking about that, let's talk about Latin America and cartels, foreign terrorist organizations. I mean, how timely is this?
Yeah.
2 days ago, Venezuelan, what they're calling drug smugglers, and I did an episode yesterday, separate, where it was more just talking about things in the current news. I don't have enough data, nor no, I think enough has been released truly about who was in that boat, necessarily the why, how they came to that. But the person I was talking to, he was an FBI agent for quite some time, and I'm trying to think of a time in my life, and this may be because they didn't release the information or I just wasn't paying attention, but you are immersed in this world. Can you recall, or do you know of a kinetic strike that seems to have occurred like the one that just recently did on people who they acclaim were purely drug smugglers in international water?
The only parallel I see was a DEA operation. I think it was 2012. And it was DEA in conjunction with local authorities. And I'm not sure if they had their hands on the triggers or not, or they're just kind of there as the operators, and the ones who are pulling the triggers were the local Hondurans. But they were chasing a boat in a river, and they shot at the boat, and several people in the boat died. It wasn't blasted over social media by the president at the time. And there was a very long investigation that followed. And it also followed a series of new restrictions related to DEA operations in places like Honduras. So there have been instances in which this may have happened, or variations of this happened. And the repercussions, first of all, they were hidden. And second of all, the repercussions for the authorities involved were far and wide and deep. And so this is a completely different environment, if nothing else.
I saw, I don't have a Truth Social account, so I saw somebody who had reposted on Twitter what Trump had posted. And I'm paraphrasing largely, but it essentially said, if you were going to run drugs to the United States, pay attention to what just happened. Mm-hmm. And I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime. I feel like we might have crossed a threshold here, and I don't personally understand where the line is. And I'm curious. I mean, you are immensely more educated on this topic than me. What are your thoughts when you first saw that? Assuming that these were just, in fact, drug traffickers. It is interesting they waited until they were in international waters to do this. What do you think this means going forward? What's your take when you saw that headline?
I have a similar take, that this is crossing a threshold. The threshold is in some ways legal, and I am not a legal scholar, so I'm not going to pretend to know if they did cross a line. I think the word terrorism and terrorist is doing a ton of work for them in that regard. And I think that they're leaning on that in many respects, irregardless of whether or not we think Tren de Agua was in the boat or are even terrorists. But that is what they're doing. They're using this kind of as camouflage for those actions. But it did cross a line of sorts. It reminded me of the attack, I think it was the Clinton administration affected against Al Qaeda after they bombed embassies, I think in Nairobi. They
Mm.
bombed the embassy in Nairobi, if I remember correctly. This is like 1998. And then they had a missile strike against an encampment. That is the type of strike that this seems to be. This aiming at terrorist groups writ large while they do their criminal activities, regardless of whether or not they're aimed at the United States in this case, because at first the Secretary of State said that the boat may have been headed towards Trinidad and Tobago, and then he claimed the next day that it was going to the United States. So we don't, as you're pointing out, we don't have all the information. Doesn't appear that we're going to have the information,
Hmm.
and this appears to be literally the shot across the bow, not even across the bow, into the bow, to
Yeah.
say this is how we are now going to police the drug trafficking world. And then that's a pretty big statement.
How do you think? I mean, again, you are immersed in knowledge in this world that I don't have. I have a peripheral knowledge and an understanding to a fraction of a degree. How do you think that statement will be received by organizations like Tren de Aragua or others sitting on the side, cartels in Mexico, CJNC? What do you think maybe not necessarily their response, because from a tactical level they probably have a limited ability to do so, but internally, I mean, maybe they're having their Thursday meeting right now, having a little roundtable discussion. I'm curious what you think their thoughts would be.
Well, I think we have to start with the fact that these are not top down, consolidated, vertically integrated structures. These are networks.
Hmm.
So these guys are, well, let's just leave aside for a second this whole question of Tren de Agua, which I have a huge problem with, by the way. I don't understand why they even leaned into the de Aragua designation in this case. I mean, if they were going to say it was a criminal group, they would have done a lot better saying it was the Cartel de los Soles. But we can talk about that in a minute.
Hmm.
Let's just leave that aside for a second. These criminal groups are networks. And so a lot of this stuff is outsourced. So if you're going to outsource things like transportation or renting of a boat um, or gasoline, I'm certain that this sort of activity, this action by the United States government would have some kind of reverberations, right, on
Hmm.
who would want to work in that space, right? If the risk level goes from 0 to 100, it's not 0, but if it goes from, very relatively low and you'll get picked up and tried and maybe you'll get thrown in jail in the worst case scenario, in most cases you probably won't get picked up, and then in many cases even if you do get picked up you'll get set free. So there's a lot of things in between dying in your boat and kind of nothing
Yeah.
happening, right? So there's this huge range. This now brings it to the sort of highest level, at least the possible highest level. So I think what they would be considering in their boardrooms of sorts is whether or not this is going to, first of all, where can this actually happen, right? Where can you see a military strike like this? As you pointed out, it was in international waters. I think
Yeah.
that's very important. They waited till it was international waters. It didn't do it in Venezuelan waters. That may be on the horizon, but right now it was international waters. Where else could this happen? Maybe on the U.S. border on land, maybe. Um, and then that is kind of about it. So how does how does that affect your business? Well, it affects you in terms of who you're going to be able to contract and whether you're going to be able to convince them to be continuing to be involved in this, and then where you're going to take the most care, right? And maybe you switch tactics. Maybe all of a sudden you don't use the go fast boats
Mm-hmm.
as much. Um, maybe you take to the air, but maybe the air is also a place, if there is international airspace, where these sorts of things can happen. I don't know if we're seeing any mobilization of air power. But these are at the end of the day, these are super dispersed networks. So you're going to have a really hard time dismantling them with these targeted strikes. You may impede in some regard where they might be trafficking, who they might be able to contract. But the sort of the upshot is that because of the way these things are structured, you're really not going to be able to dismantle or really do any real damage to their ability to traffic drugs into the United States, Europe, or Asia, your three largest markets.
Yeah. But how did you develop such an interest in these type of organizations, specifically in Latin America?
Well, I grew up in Chicago, and in Chicago there was always a general interest in these topics, and even in the town where I grew up, there was a history of sorts of mob presence. A very famous mobster, Sam Giancana, was killed in my hometown in 1975, which was my youth. I was too young to know what was going on back then, but it was kind of around us. My brothers played football with the grandsons of a guy named Tony Accardo, who was the largest mobster in Chicago at the time. And Tony Accardo used to go to the games with his bodyguards and things of that sort. So it was around me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of combined that general interest with what I studied. I studied history of Latin America, and a lot of that includes obviously drug trafficking, but also nefarious governments and military governments and other ways in which governments also cross over into the criminal world. So eventually they kind of combined. I think Venezuela, going back to that example, is a good one right now. If you look at the Venezuelan regime, in many ways, it's more or less a criminal state.
Mm-hmm.
And so those sorts of ideas kind of melded, and I've always just been interested in the how and the why and how all of that works. And so I just sort of have always leaned into that part of my professional career.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard me talk about Firecracker Farm and their hot salt. You probably heard other people talk about it as well. If you haven't tried it yet, let me just tell you, you're missing out on some serious flavor. Their hot salt is delicious, and it really makes pretty much anything that you put it on even more delicious. It's hot, but when you use it in moderation, it's not too hot, and the flavor that it adds enhances without overpowering. It is handmade, super premium, and comes in awesome stainless steel push-button grinders like the one I have in my hand right here. You can take them anywhere. Hot sauce, if you've had this experience, can very easily overpower other flavors and always runs out quickly when it's good. Hot salt lasts and lasts. The push grinder holds over 500 plus pumps, and when you consider the refill it comes with, it's thousands of servings, and it's a great deal and a lot cheaper than the sauce. For those of you that like flavor but hesitate because it might be too hot, you can mix it with sea salt to tone it down and still enjoy the awesome flavor. In my personal experience, you can modulate how much comes out of the dispenser. You're in total control of the amount of heat you serve yourself. So if you would like to support our show and give Alex and his family business a shot, head over to firecracker.farm and use the code Ironclad to get a 15% discount on your first order. You will be very glad that you did. Firecracker.farm. Do you think it is a mistake I think your average American could probably repeat some of the names of the cartels that they've heard about. Probably more, I bet you Sinaloa, maybe Jalisco, specifically for things that are very proximal to the US. I think maybe at this point, well, actually, maybe MS-13 as well, too, or TDA. But do you think it is a mistake for our government to lump in cartels largely based in Mexico with Latin American and just roll them up into this FTO designation? Do you actually think it confuses people, or it actually muddies the water in the similarities and differences between those organizations?
It's a good question. I'm not sure what the end goal is here, but I do feel like it is to give them the kind of cover that they needed to do the type of operation that they did the other day.
I would tend to agree. I have no data to support that. And then also
Yeah.
maybe a mechanism to have harsher penalties or more operational tools that for people who may be supporting them inside of the US, specifically probably the cartels from Mexico.
It gives them all kinds of political top cover in many
Hmm.
regards. And it may give them, in some respects, and again, I'm not a legal scholar, but some kind of legal top cover as well. It also gives them more tools. They can do things such as set up wires on criminal or suspected criminal groups and suspected criminals in other countries without having to go through your normal mechanisms, your normal agreements that you establish. So all of a sudden, you're able to do things without asking permission. That's an incredible amount of power. And that's a lot of judicial reach that gives them. It certainly gives them the power to sanction, and those sanctions can ripple across a huge network. So you can put sanctions across, not just obviously the direct actors involved, but their cousins, their sisters, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it just allows them to spread their net
Hmm.
over an entire network in a way that they can't normally, with other types of legal mechanisms. So there's a whole host of advantages that come with the designation of foreign terrorist group. I don't I don't agree with these designations, but I can see why they have chosen to use this as a tool. I think it also helps them in their efforts to use presidential decrees in ways that we haven't seen before either. Um, I think the case of the Alien Enemies Act is probably the most relevant in that regard. You have a foreign foreign terrorist designee that is
Hmm.
being named as the principal reason or justification for establishing the Alien Enemies Act, and using it as a mechanism to um, round up undocumented people and deport them. So these are mechanisms that can be used on an international scale and on a
Yeah.
domestic scale, and it is super powerful. And they can help them tell a story. And I think at the end of the day, this is one of the most important things for the Trump administration is narrative. And so this is why you get this operation that is then spread by the president himself and with video included. This is part of a narrative that they're creating. So it
Yeah.
is part and parcel of the narrative.
It didn't accidentally end up on social media for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a constitutional scholar by any stretch or a legal scholar, but I also don't know how many people realize that by invoking the Alien Enemies Act, that it actually gives them the ability to deport people without due process,
Mm.
which is something that is very constitutionally important.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
these tools are it's much like the Patriot Act, something I go back to all the time. Sounds
Yeah,
great.
you're right.
Who you're not a patriot? You don't want to support the Patriot Act? Well, actually, I
Hmm.
like my privacy.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of what the Patriot Act does. The name spectacular, 5 stars for your branding
Hmm.
department, But I mean, we're never getting those freedoms back either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, that's a good point too. I mean, once you go down this road, it's really hard to sort of claw it back.
there's not a lot of good examples of once you give the government power, them saying,
Mm,
we don't need this. Let's give it back to the
yeah.
people. There's plenty of examples of the other way, but yeah, there's not a really big, thick Steinbeck novel worth of examples of it going back in the favor of the citizens. So,
The other thing that this does too is, in many ways, it gives other countries a green light to do similar operations, and this is something that is, I mean, if you think about the last really 30 years, almost 30 years of U.S. government foreign policy has been about trying to train security forces in human rights protocols across the globe. And if they are not following those protocols, there are potential sanctions that the U.S. can levy, and so this is also a huge shift away from that. If we spent the last 20 to 30 years trying to train security forces in international law and human rights protocols, well, you can pretty much toss all that into the garbage can after the other day.
yeah. Um, if you were to compare the cartels that directly abut our southern border versus Latin America, are they defined by their similarities or are there vast differences in how they conduct business?
Again, a great question. The ones that abut the border, um, like many of these groups, they have a very specific value add to the market. And that is that they are great at moving contraband, most notably drugs, because that's what we're focused on most of the time, but contraband writ large over that border. And this is drugs one way, maybe guns and money the other way. But that's what they're good at. This is their value add. This is what they add to the market. And this is why they've become so powerful on an economic level, on a political level, on a social level, is because they're really good at transport, right? They're just giant, amazing, sophisticated transport companies, basically. Um, and that's what they specialize in. Now, what we have seen with a lot of these groups is that whether the group as a whole or parts of the group, um, they are getting involved in other types of criminal operations over the years. I mean, for a long time, they did not care, nor were they involved in things like human smuggling.
Mm-hmm.
In the last 5 years, really kind of 5 to 7 years, the ones along the border, the sort of Mexican border, all of a sudden realize they don't necessarily have to be directly involved. They don't need to present or give up their infrastructure, logistics, or put at risk anything else that they're doing. Because they control that physical space, the only thing they need to do is collect money. So literally, what they do is they establish basically it's like they are like the super trolls under the bridge, right? Collecting your quotas, and they just collect per head of from the coyotes that are moving these guys through. This has
Mm-hmm.
been a remarkably large business proposition for them, and was for many years. That is really going through now an absolute upheaval, because say what you will about Trump, what he has done along the border has without question changed those patterns. And so, I mean, I was in Juarez a couple of weeks ago and went to one of these shelters, and under normal circumstances they would have 500 people there, plus they had an overflow spot which would have another 600 or so, so anywhere between 1,000 and 1,100 people. They had 32 when I visited them, and those
Wow.
32, the person I spoke with told me, were headed back to their countries of origin. They weren't even headed north anymore. So this is an amazing turn of events that makes for a lot of tumult along the borders. You get a lot of these factions that have gotten involved in all of these different aspects of drug trafficking, human smuggling, and then they start to fight one another over other different kinds of criminal economies. So that's kind of the sort of the lay of the land as it is in places like the U.S.-Mexico border. There are other groups like the Tren de Aragua, which is not a criminal group. It is barely a criminal network. It is a widely dispersed brand name more than anything else. There's no vertical integration whatsoever. It's just various factions of the criminal group and different levels of sophistication in each of these factions. The sort of Chilean faction and the Peruvian factions being some of the more sophisticated of these factions. The United States, I don't even really want to call it faction because there's just very small evidence of cells that are barely operational in many of these places in the U.S. So you have these disparate factions who are not communicating with one another. They're not involved, and this goes back to the operation the other day, which is why I question why they would designate these guys as Tren de Aragua. Tren de Aragua is not an international drug trafficking organization. I don't mean to downplay what Tren de Aragua is. They do a lot of terrible things. They are violent and vicious criminal group where they are operational in mostly we're talking about Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and Chile, but they are not international drug traffickers. This was the odd thing when I saw this. I was like, the Cartel of the Soles, which was mentioned in also some other designations, that is an international drug trafficking organization that uses and has used the Caribbean for decades. I have been reporting on the Cartel de los Soles since 2005. That's the first story I wrote about them from Venezuela. And that's another sort of disparate criminal organization that is an international drug trafficking organization and does have contacts with international drug trafficking organizations in the region in order to move drugs from Venezuela and then use these other Caribbean islands as platforms or as respites on their way to the US or maybe on their way to Europe, or maybe both. Maybe that's where the cocaine might be going to 2 different places or 3 different places. So there are lots of possibilities there. And the Cartel de los Soles is a much more believable suspect to be managing that kind of infrastructure, a go-fast boat with a seemingly good-sized crew. That's a big boat. That's a big crew. It's a very open thing to do. I mean, you know, a lot of these things, yeah, they do happen on go fast, but a lot of them happen in concealed containment areas on fishing vessels and things of that sort. So it seemed like a fairly brazen move on the part of the criminal organization as well. And, you know, I think we'll probably see changes going back to your earlier question. About how they will operate going forward. So those are some of the differences between your different groups that are operational in the region.
If you are into quality gear and you are not subscribed to TacPack, well, then you're missing out. TacPack is a monthly subscription box loaded with professional-grade tactical gear from trusted brands like Battle Arms Development, 9Line, 511 Tactical. You have 2 options. You have the TacPack Standard, which is a $59.95 shipped with a value that usually lands between $90 and $120. Or you have the TacPack Plus, which is $139.95 shipped, packed with about $240 to $300 worth of gear. But here's the kicker. The September TacPack Plus is coming in hot, worth over $330, and it's featuring a record amount of gear. And right now, if you use the code Ironclad, you're going to get a free tactical gift worth $70. Bringing your total value to over $400 just for signing up. So visit TacPack.com, use the code Ironclad, and get the kind of gear that doesn't just sit on the shelf. Before I forget, I have a question for you about the southern border And before I ask it, I'm not I do my absolute best not to view the world and all my entire life through a political lens. Honestly, most of the time, I'm right down the middle of the road. But the numbers are the numbers. I mean, and it is, and I'm listening to, and I only have access to publicly disclosed numbers about what's happening at the southern border and the reduction. And, it seems like you anecdotally saw it with your own eyes, the reduction. And again, trying to strip politics out of this as much as possible, I will ask myself, well, if it was possible to turn off the influx of people at the border, if it's been now shown that it could have been done, what would be the argument for the previous 4 years for having not done it?
Well, I think there's a resource question, um, and that is this is being done at at an incredibly high cost.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be a resource question that we're not necessarily facing in the short term. And those are decisions that we have to make as I think as a society. Where are we going to place emphasis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where are you going to like it is in any law enforcement
Yeah.
operation, right? Where are
You
you
have
going to
limited
deploy your
assets. Yep,
forces,
totally.
right?
Yep.
Limited amount of assets. And then some crimes, I think, as a law enforcement or former law enforcement person, or at least contact with that world, you understand that you're going to prioritize some things over others. So I think those things certainly were at play. I think there's a certain amount of tolerance that was built in to the system, both political tolerance but also economic tolerance. I think for many elite members of the United States, elite economic elites and political elites, it's beneficial to have this flow of low cost labor. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're talking about here is keeping, to a certain extent, we're talking about keeping labor costs to a minimum. Um, if we're going to be really crass and cold about it, and so I think there's kind of elements of both at work there. Both your resource question on one end, and deployment questions, and then on the other end your sort of built-in tolerance over time. And then I think there's a third element of this, which is really the part that kind of tears at the soul of the United States of America right now, which is our belief in who we are, right? What are we? Are we a nation of immigrants, or aren't we? Or are we a nation of some immigrants and maybe others not? And that is sort of tearing at the heartstrings, and is the ideological fodder that everybody uses to rile up their base, regardless of what side of the
Yeah.
of the issue you come from. So there's a lot kind of built into this, and I think um, at this point we are. It feels like we are really kind of tearing at each other right now. This is something that is at this point feels like it's being used in all kinds of ways that no one imagined before. Um, but you're right, when you take a step back and you go, wow. And I was surprised as well to see, and I kind of felt it even before like it was just after the election. I was down on the border. I was in Nogales, and it was right around the election. Trump had just
Mm-hmm.
been elected, and it was almost instantaneous. The chatter amongst those who were planning on going, they were either accelerating their plans, or they were making plans to go back. I mean, it was to go back to their home countries. It was almost immediate. And again, that's anecdotal.
Mm-hmm.
So take it for what it's worth, but use that, and then to then go back again and be in Juarez, and then be in this encampment that used to be full, and there's no one there. I mean, no
Yeah.
one. It's incredible. Um, so I don't know what to make of it. I do think that in general, and again, I'm not an economist, but there is a part of the economy that is dependent on this labor. And I think it remains to be seen how much of that push and pull is going to play out
Yeah.
in all this, and will there be some sort of like some level of tolerance, even if it's far lower than what we became accustomed to.
Yeah, I certainly don't have a complex answer to that question, or a deep one either. It's something that I think about, and man, I do my best to view almost every topic apolitically, because I get the same sensation that I think that you feel. It's almost every topic now is being weaponized towards a base of some kind. And, I mean, I didn't pay attention to our society a whole lot in my 20s. If I'm being honest, I felt like I was more the center of the universe. I thought society should pay attention to me in my 20s. But now, it's funny how that works. And you get a few laps around the sun more. Now I'm paying attention more. And I don't know if I've ever seen. Well, mostly it's online. It seems very divided. Very unfrequently or infrequently do I encounter it in my day-to-day life. I encounter it far more online, and I've also, but then it's like you have arguments about, or conversations about the dead internet being 80% of it being bot traffic at this point. Are you arguing with a real person? It's a wild one out there. So I do my best to try to understand and look at things apolitically. So, and then not that I'm immune to being riled up by things viewed from a certain angle, but I'm doing my best to recognize that that's happening. It still leaves you with those questions like that, like, okay, well, why didn't somebody else do something about it? Or what was, and again, I don't have the answers, but I try to spend my time thinking about those things.
Well, if we go back to the 1970s, I mean, there was a time in which that flow, that migration in and out of the U.S., especially during the harvest season, was normal.
Yeah.
And so there's an argument that is like, well, we why did we start to restrict it? Because once you started to restrict it, then that forced people to stay permanently in the
Yeah.
U.S., where they used to come in and then they would go back to their home countries, which is what they prefer. And maybe we should be angling towards the ability to continue that. And if you can create a regime in which you allow this movement in and then movement out, and so you incentivize that. I don't know, but I mean, I think that there's got we have to look for, I think, continue to look for some kind of middle ground there, where it's not criminalizing everything, um, but it's also not open door for everybody. So it's
Yeah.
and right now, given given the political climate, as you're pointing out, it's not really a great environment to be throwing out proposals that are somewhere in the middle. You get crushed if you stand in the middle right now.
Oh, I've been told apparently it doesn't exist. I'm like,
It
okay,
doesn't exist
thanks.
anymore. Yeah,
Well, I'm
exactly.
going to create it and make it exist, because I go left or right depending on the issue. It's like I actually
Hmm.
probably have a foot straddling each line, and that blows up people's brains, and I don't know what to say about that. So
Yeah, well, that's great. I appreciate that. That's. I mean, I think that is the most honest thing that can happen, is just to take a step back and to say, well, this seems to be working. This doesn't seem to be working, independent of where the ideas are coming.
yeah. Yeah, one of the things I noticed when it comes to specifically cartels, the U.S. takes this approach of almost kingpins or key figures, as if these things exist with just one person at the very top and they are the marionette player or the stereo equalizer.
Hmm.
Do you think that actually is that just more for political optics, so we can claim a win when we trick, or internally have them tricked to get on an airplane that lands in Texas instead of Mexico, or we roll one of these
Hmm.
people up? How much impact does it actually have? Because I feel like there's almost an instantaneous backfill. Yes, there could be power fighting inside of those countries, but does it really weaken the organizations are? And are we making a mistake by looking at these things as if there is an actual kingpin at the very top?
Yeah, I mean this goes back obviously way back. If you think about
Mob style too, like you were saying, Chicago. I mean, it was the same thing.
same thing. Even if we're just going to talk about Latin America, I mean Pablo Escobar, obviously,
Yep.
when he was killed, the whole idea this is over. When in fact, those who helped kill him, which included criminal groups and paramilitaries,
He
became
definitely
the
wasn't killed by an army soldier. Wink,
yeah,
wink.
not just that, but those guys who killed him became the single largest criminal organization on planet Earth in the years that followed.
Yeah.
And so it's like hardly the solution um, to take out these kingpins. And you see that the repercussions of this. We see it all the time in our work at Inside Crime, which is chronicling the atomization of these groups. I mean, they just fragment into a zillion pieces, and it becomes over time incredibly difficult for these governments and the US trying to help these governments deal with these atomized criminal groups. And the atomized criminal groups are not just spread across a number of different groups. All of a sudden, they're involved in a whole other series of criminal economies, which aren't necessarily international drug trafficking. They're local criminal economies, local contraband and illegal liquor markets and prostitution and local drug peddling and all of these things that operate on a local level. So all of a sudden, your biggest threats are not just international groups or groups that are operating on an international level, but they're local as well. And this is what we have seen over and over and over again. Now, having said that, there is a legitimacy question embedded in all this. If you let the kingpin operate, or if you let the kingpin be a kingpin, then they are challenging your monopoly on power. If you're a
Mhm.
government and you allow that, that you can't stand for that, right? You have to exert some command and control over the physical space that is your sovereign nation, right? And I think in that regard, the sort of the idea of kingpins and going after high level traffickers remains to some extent important, but it's been greatly diluted over the last 20 years in particular, as these groups become more fragmented and they
Mhm.
become more like we were describing the Tren de Aragua and even the Cartel de los Soles and all these other groups. They're becoming networks. They're networks of networks. So even if you take out a very high level node, in this case, maybe a command structure, they are replaced very quickly with others who have been operating independently or semi-independently for years already. So this is something that if you're trying to mitigate this problem, going after a kingpin is only going to take you so far.
And in that respect, I will say there are definite and connected parallels between terrorist organizations. I think we saw this with Al Qaeda and ISIS and how they realized that working in large groups co-located together, you're either going to have some people arrive at your doorstep or you're going to vaporize. So they became very disaggregate. Their communication changed,
Mm.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that they reached the level of the terrorist organization, shifting back over to the drug trafficking. And I think our language has to be very precise for the
Mm-hmm.
reasons, one, just if words are going to mean something, they need to actually mean something. But two, because of this additional lever of tools, going back to the strike in Venezuela, I wonder, I'm thinking, okay, where is our line now? Are we going to drone strike a cartel drug shipment south of the border 5 miles? Is this the new world that we're living in? And I don't have the answer to that. But that's
Mm-hmm.
immediately where my brain jumped to.
Absolutely, and that's the discussion about whether or not it happened in international waters or Venezuelan waters.
Yeah.
Is the next strike going to be in Venezuelan waters or maybe on land? I don't expect it to be human led. I would expect it to be drone or missile or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and and is any of that even effective, right? I mean, how much is this just a cover for a desire to go after the Maduro, the Nicolas Maduro
Mm-hmm.
administration in Venezuela? He's the president of Venezuela, and I don't know. We got all bent out of shape about the pretext used for the invasion of Iraq. Shouldn't we also be questioning, as investigators, as journalists, the pretext being used to increasingly encroach on Venezuela's sovereignty and maybe even setting the stage for some kind of military action in Venezuela? My answer would obviously be yes, and that's what I'm doing by asking these questions is, to what extent are these even terrorist groups or targets that can be treated as threats to the United States? I don't know.
You don't want to back away from that. I fight on always.
Scene 101A, take 3.
If you're prepared for the worst case scenarios, those worst case scenarios are gonna be manageable.
I got out because we weren't at war. We're at war. I'm going back.
I want to quit like anybody else. I just have the mentality I don't.
I thought I knew what pain was up until that moment.
Accuracy is by far the most important thing.
This community aided in who I am. It gave me family.
No fail it's everything. It's a way of life.
All right, action.
Well, you mentioned corruption earlier too, and I mean, I can use Venezuela and Mexico as an example. People will say it's an open secret that there's corruption in the Mexican government or infiltration by the cartels. I don't know why you would use the term secret in that. Let's just say it's loosely held, accepted knowledge that that's the case. You could obviously speak to Venezuela at a much deeper degree, but I've heard largely the same things. And honestly, if you were to compare the two, it seems like the level of corruption in Venezuela might actually be higher than Mexico. But if that's the case, so let's say that corruption is there. Is it even possible, you think, to dismantle these groups without dismantling part of these nation states as well? I mean, how do you do this?
That's the key question, right? How are you going to separate the pieces? How are you going to disaggregate the corrupt military forces that are operational in Venezuela, that are operational in Mexico, from the actual criminal organizations themselves? I don't think we have the answer to that. I don't think we know what it is, what it looks like. What does an invasion of or a dismantling of a narco-state look like? I don't know.
I have no answer.
What does that look like? And especially, Venezuela is a place that has a lot of allies. The Cubans would be their long-standing allies, but they're also connected to the Chinese and to the Russians. And what does an invasion look like there? I don't know. I'm not sure. What are we talking about here? So it is a very difficult question, and I don't think we have the answer to it. And I'm not sure, at least I'm not getting any indications that this administration has a nuanced strategy going forward. It seems like a sort of there's a nail and I have a hammer strategy right now, and let's hope that it's a little bit more sophisticated behind closed curtains.
It's a very dangerous strategy. I mean, I spent years of my life looking backwards. You can use Iraq as an example. The hammer and nail strategy is really, really dangerous if you start thinking that the hammer is the only tool that you have, because you start seeing everything as a nail. Mm-hmm. And there's enough examples in history to prove that hammers are effective when you're building a house, but they can also destroy things. as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not cautious in your attempt to build a house, you might destroy the entire neighborhood.
Yeah. And going back to the scenario in which you have a drone that strikes inside of Venezuela, a U.S. drone that strikes inside of Mexican territory. What does that do to bilateral relations?
Oh, man.
That is, we pretty much cut off drug cooperation, anti-drug cooperation with Mexico when the U.S. went in and did what would be now called an extraordinary rendition of a doctor who had allegedly participated in the murder of Enrique Camarena, this famous DEA agent that was taken by the sort of precursors to the Jalisco cartel. And they had tortured Camarena, and this doctor had allegedly, nursed him back to health and all of these other things. The U.S., the DEA in particular, took this doctor out of Mexico. I want to say it was 1988 or 89, in an extraordinary rendition. They didn't have permission. And that cut off counter narcotics cooperation for close to 20 years. What does a drone strike do? That is a whole nother level.
I'll take it a step further, because this is what I worry about.
Yeah.
Let's say it's, I would assume it would have to be, if they were to do that in Mexico, there'd have to be something incredibly compelling. A 5-step, maybe it's a key personnel. Maybe they have legitimately identified somebody they believe to be a terrorist. Well, let's say there's not a drone in the area, but they're able to track it. Maybe there's just a surveillance platform. What if it crosses into the U.S.? Are we going to do a drone strike inside of the U.S. because there's no law enforcement personnel there that are able to action that? Because that becomes a law enforcement problem. What if we identify key people in the U.S. that are providing material support, or we believe, or somebody can be convinced that they are an integral part of this terrorist organization? Are we going to strike them in the U.S. with the drone? This is a Jacob's ladder, just absolutely out of control if not kept in check. That's what keeps me staring at the ceiling fan at night.
It is just this, there's increasingly less and less parameters around which your sort of rules of engagement.
I can see conversations being had where explanations are provided, where it appears to be the most compelling, the least impactful option. And at the same time, you're just marching towards and eroding constitutional protections that are existing for the citizens that you are claiming in doing that strike, you are actually serving or making safer. I just think that's the beginning of the end.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, and in some respects, it's already going on as it relates to immigration enforcement. So that erosion can happen on multiple fronts at once, and all under the guise of combating criminal groups or terrorist groups or some combination thereof. And that's the space where we are right now. And it's a very tricky thing, because again, it's not to downplay the threat that these groups pose. Mostly, 99% of the threat is outside of the United States. I would be very, even the groups that we think of as, these groups that have been crossing borders for years. I wrote a book on the MS-13. The MS-13 was born in the United States. It was a Los Angeles-based gang. So those are kind of homegrown threats, but your outside threats that are being tossed around now, your Tren de Aguas, are really, even your Jalisco and your Sinaloa cartel type threats. These are criminal organizations that are looking to battle the U.S. military under any circumstances. They're seeking to avoid and actively discourage, all the way to using violence themselves, they discourage violence and criminal activity very often in the areas that they control because it's really bad for business.
Yeah.
I mean, these are business people. They're not out to disrupt if they can help it business. I mean, if they need to move into a particular market, they may try and move in a violent fashion, but violence and conflict with the state are bad for business. So again, going back to your point about we want to be very clear about what their goals are. Well, I think we need to start there. Like if you want to change their motivations, well, we need to think about what their motivations are. And their motivations are not political. These are not political groups. So this is why this is sort of the central challenge of being designated as a terrorist group. It implies that you have some sort of ideology, some sort of political goal, and you don't. I mean, you're not. These aren't political groups. These are in some ways social groups. They interact with politicians to their own ends, but they're not. They're not political organizations. They're not like guerrilla insurgencies. They're not like the Al Qaeda's, of the world that do have some kind of end goal and ideology and want to, create some sort of state. In the end, they don't. They want to use the portions of the state that will help them achieve their economic goals. So this is something that we need to be clearer about, I think, if we're actually going to mitigate them in a way that is effective.
To buttress your point about their avoidance of violence to stay under the radar and outside of the eyes of the state, I've done quite a few episodes now talking with people about these organizations and their presence in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And, Canadian officials will tell you one story. People that I talk to who have interfaced with these organizations on the ground will tell you another. But those on the ground, when they're talking to them, they're under a very, let's stay under the radar, avoid violence at all costs because of exactly what you said. They're not looking for maximum friction. They're looking for maximum ease of movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this is why. So the whole idea of the we're going to buttress the border in between the points of entry. Okay, I can see somewhat the logic there, but what we know from the from studying these criminal groups for many many years is that they still use the main ports of entry to to enter the drugs and other contraband and to get the money and to get the weapons. They're going through the easiest way to go through, which is the points of entry, the major cities. So this whole idea we have in our mind and it's reinforced by television series, these tunnels. And yeah, of course there are tunnels. And of course these guys are moving stuff through deserts and things of that sort. But most of the stuff continues to land in major seaports, airports, go through ports of entry. This is hide in plain sight sort of strategy. And so, the belief that we're going to then use. So what are you going to do to fight that? Are you going to you're going to use the military to fight that? Is that what this is? And that's really not long term. That isn't going to do it. It makes for a great show, and certainly may scare some people off. But in the long term, these guys are going to continue to use the same mechanisms that all other businesses use, which are these main ports of entry.
If you could, last question for you today, be respectful of your time. If you were, regardless, strip out whoever's in office now, this term, next term, whatever it may be. But if you got a chance to, go brief the decision makers directly, what advice would you leave them with? You get 5 minutes with them, and they're at least required to pay attention to you. I don't think we can force them to do a damn thing you say, but they're at least required to pay attention. What advice would you leave them with?
I have to say, I hate this question.
Yes,
I will
perfect
do
ending.
my best. I will do my best to answer it, because it is actually realistic. I think most of these things they are elevator pitches.
Yeah.
I would say you're going to have to steer the ship in a different direction. Right now, your ship continues to be mostly centered around law enforcement efforts that are very expensive and while they are important, have never proven to be able to dismantle these criminal groups in any effective manner. That you need to reboot this and think about all the different ways in which you could mitigate this problem, from the most basic thing, like basic services, and think about this holistically. Basic services of schools and healthcare and access to, family assistance and all of that. And then to your most sort of radical options, nuclear options that we see being deployed now on a routine basis, which is blowing up these guys in the sea. So I just think you need to reboot and think about this in a way that's much more holistic and spread out those resources. And we might be surprised at some of the results over the medium to long term.
Isn't it wild that the reality is that it is likely an elevator pitch?
So much an elevator pitch, and no one is buying that, by the way.
But you might get 5. You know what I mean? Or maybe you'd get more time with a lower level decision maker. But it is fat. I mean, I hope there's entire teams of people and design. But I think at the end of the day, you might get 5.
Yeah, and I mean, this is why part of the reason why we created an organization is because you get a lot of bites at that apple.
Yeah.
And so you have a certain means by which you can access people on a regular basis, which we do, and you just hammer away at it. You hammer away as best you can at what you have seen on the ground. You're with the best available evidence and information that you have, and then you try and relay that in a way that will be so that the policy is more effective over the long term. That's all you can do.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad there's people out there like you doing it. So, Steven, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you would like to learn more about Steven's work or follow along in his journey, please visit insightcrime.org, and we'll have a link to that down in the show notes for you. Thank you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode and an all-new guest. See you then.